At the suggestion of a friend, about a year ago, we started diving into the history of our country. And not just reading the Constitution to read it, to say that we've read it, but we started to gain a desire to really understand where the founders were coming from. What was the world like that they lived in? What circumstances were they living in? What was their mindset toward life? What principles were they studying? What works were they studying? And it's been an amazing experience to begin to grasp how much wisdom and how much inspiration went into the founding of this amazing country, the United States of America. So I believe it's important to mention that before discussing current events, because no matter what I say, I believe it needs to be understood at the level of principles and not just facts and history, things that happened. And so that's an important groundwork to lay.
In conclusion, may I say that one of our most serious problems is the inferiority complex which people feel when they are not informed and organized. They dare not make a decision on these vital issues. They let other people think for them. They stumble around in the middle of the road trying to avoid being controversial and get hit by traffic going both ways.
Have you ever heard any advertising on TV to consume less? No. No way. Whether you need a six-cylinder car or not, you have to buy it. And hurry up.
Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "Those who will learn nothing from history are condemned to repeat it."
History can be analyzed in numerous ways. Lessons we can learn from it are endless. People have always overcome enormous challenges. We learn from them that we can handle more adversity than we realize. Perhaps some people won't reach the same conclusions as this analysis of history does. The important thing is to do our best to have an open mind and a willingness to listen and learn from multiple sources and viewpoints. This documentary was not created to spread fear. In fact, I don't want you to have fear. We begin with the political spectrum and the founding fathers of the United States. Through their study of history, basically they came up with the spectrum that's similar to this. Now, there are a lot of ways to draw up political spectrums. Typically in today's world, we'll see communism on the left and fascism on the right. However, the founders looked at it in regards to the amount of weight the people had versus how much a leader had in the government. On the left is tyranny, where one person or group has total control of the law. On the right, people are essentially on their own individually. Another way to put this is anarchy. In my understanding of this, fascism and socialism are on the left. The final stage in communism is essentially no government, so this would end up on the right. In practice, it's on the left. All of this will be explained later on. The founders installed important safeguards such as separation of powers and checks and balances in order to keep one group of government from gaining too much power. For the founders, tyranny was one of the few things that was to be avoided at all costs. Fortunately, George Washington set a great precedence in his refusal to be a king. Heaven knows what he could have become if he had more power. Even if he did the right thing, he knew that in the future, any leader with king-like power would almost certainly abuse it. The point is, the founders wanted the perfect possible solution given the propensity of humans to be fallible. James Madison said, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." This says that humans are flawed and need government, but how much government and how to administer said government are issues that haven't been completely settled. Just how do you get to that perfect balance so that people can best thrive? The Articles of Confederation ruled the 13 colonies after the Revolutionary War, but they were too weak. Ronald Reagan echoed the same predicament of having a government that's too strong.
And yet, before too long, the same people were saying, "What's wrong with government control?" And in the recent days, we've heard representatives in the higher echelons of government ask us, Well, are you afraid of your own government? Well, to tell you the truth, I am. And
How do you build a strong government that protects its people and yet maintains individual sovereignty and rights? Constitution Camp director and co-founder of Independence Forever, Nathan Phelps, explains how the solution isn't as easy as going with a democracy.
The idea of democracy is kind of unduly glorified these days. You know, people kind of put the concept of democracy on a pedestal and act as if democracy is an end in itself. I think the founders would disagree with that. John Adams, one of my favorite founding fathers, said that the proposition that the people themselves are the best keepers of their own liberties is not true. In fact, he said that they are the worst conceivable keepers of their own liberties, and that there are no keepers at all. James Madison said that democracies are as short in their lives as they are violent in their deaths. Point is, founders didn't think that democracy was the end-all be-all, and so that's why they set about to institute a constitution that would protect us from and protect the people from their own human frailties, specifically the human frailties of their leaders, their rulers. And so that, you know, the way they accomplished this through the Constitution is absolutely miraculous, in my opinion. You know, because in the Constitution, the system that they gave us was a system whereby the ambition of people would be counteracted by ambition.
Some people in the U.S. no longer feel the need to have the Constitution. While the country has not been perfect, things would almost certainly have been worse without it.
In my opinion, the Constitution is never really outdated, at least not in the principles underlying the Constitution. You know, we hear a lot about the living, breathing Constitution, which, of course, you know, okay, the Constitution is living and breathing in the sense that there's always a path to amend the Constitution. It's not living and breathing in the sense that the meaning of it can change. The meaning of it is based on the presumption of our human frailties, and that will never change because we will always have human frailties.
man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism.
While the founders were wary of human nature, another prominent thinker would have a very different political perspective. The Communist Manifesto was authored by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, although Engels was the lesser recognized of the two. If the Communist Manifesto itself isn't enough to concern people, Marx's woeful life should be enough to know that his motives behind socialism and communism weren't exactly angelic. As just one example to illustrate this, Marx's father charged him with being possessed. The Communist Manifesto is not a poorly written literature. The work is quite flattering if taken at face value. Who doesn't want a world free from division and a world with equality? Former Soviet agent and defector Yuri Bezmenov addressed equality.
Equality. Equality. Mind you, you cannot legislate equality. If you want to be equal, you have to be equal. You have to deserve it. And yet we build our society on the principle of equality. We say people are equal. We know it is false. It's a lie. Some people are tall and stupid. Others are short, bold, and clever. Equal opportunity in equal circumstances, yes, but we know people are different. To excel, yes, provided we reach the same level of excellency, perfection, which is hypothetical, distant future. Yes, maybe. But we know perfectly well that even with the best intentions, people could not be equal. If we make them equal by force, if we put the principle of equality in the basis of our socio-political structure, it's the same thing as building a house on sand. Sooner or later, it will collapse, and that's exactly what happens.
Unlike the American founding fathers' view that one must be cautious of human nature, the Communist Manifesto essentially claims that the structure of society is to be blamed for human weakness. Thus, phrases like the bourgeoisie supremacy show up. The bourgeoisie are the ruling class, which includes, for example, business owners. Against the bourgeoisie are the proletariat, or the working class. Because the proletariat are oppressed by the bourgeoisie, the communists call for a revolution to overthrow that ruling class. The new proletarian government is to use socialist principles of controlling means of production and eventually owning all property. Goods are then to be equally divided to the people. In time, the government is supposed to be disbanded as well. In their manifesto, Marx and Engels shared no hesitation in expressing some of the most extreme views. Abolition of private property is only the beginning. The manifesto states, quote, "Abolition of the family, even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists." End quote. They went even further, though. Quote, "Communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality." End quote. People must be vigilant in support of values found in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. People must not fall for the temptations socialism and communism present. What about the claim that communism was implemented by the wrong people or in the wrong way? Dr. Jordan Peterson explains,
I would say that anybody with more than a cursory knowledge of 20th century history who dares to claim simultaneously that they have compassion for the downtrodden and that they're Marxists are revealing either an ignorance of history that's so astounding that it's actually a form of miracle, or a kind of malevolence that's so reprehensible that it's almost unspeakable. Because we already ran the equity experiment over the course of the 20th century, and we already know what the Marxist doctrines have done for oppressed people all around the world, and the answer to that mostly was imprison, enslave.
While Marx was promoting communism, he also expressed his desires to hold power during and after revolution. Essentially, that's one takeaway a reader can get. The Communist Manifesto essentially is a blueprint for gaining power. Because of human nature, the reportedly positive aspects of communism don't get carried out. We'll explore this more throughout the documentary. The lessons are limitless. We can only hope more of us can learn them soon. Although there had been many revolutionary movements, communists never got power of a country until after World War I. The Russian Revolution was a long time coming. There was scattered unrest for decades and a minor revolution in 1905. The 1917 Russian Revolution was split into two main parts. At the onset of the revolution in February, there was widespread unrest and looting. By early March, Tsar Nicholas II resigned. A provisional democratic government was set up. Socialists and communists had power in this government, but of course that wasn't enough. The Bolsheviks, a faction, primarily promoted peace and workers' rights to gain influence. They wanted to pull out of war with Germany. After 7 months of the provisional government, the Bolsheviks moved towards complete government control through a coup. Oddly enough, the Bolsheviks kicked out many people you'd think they would like, such as many socialists and even communists that didn't line up with their way of thinking. The leader of this group was Vladimir Lenin. His forces were able to take important railroad and communication centers. This, along with other advantages, helped Lenin and the Bolsheviks to gain control of Russia and beat the forces that opposed him. In Lenin's new Russia, which he called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the new economic policy, or NEP, was introduced and allowed a decent free market to take place. This policy would all but be erased as Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, took power soon after Lenin's death in 1924. The reason for using the NEP is most likely given in the Communist Manifesto. Temporarily use capitalism to create wealth before socializing the country. The nation had catching up to do, and it's quite senile actually to see how the communists will leech off the same economic system they vilify for their own personal gain and motives. In its 70-year history, the USSR would have multiple disasters in its operations. It's also worth mentioning that at the time of revolution, a communist international organization would form and would quickly gain a foothold in the US. The group created violence and drew support from people in the government itself. As the USSR was establishing itself, another nation would have its own new government rise.
Meanwhile, another dictatorship arose.
A man named Adolf Hitler sulked at the predicament his country Germany was in. His country lost a war. His country had to pay for such war. Meanwhile, the thoughts of Jews or communists prospering made his blood boil. If you recall the political spectrum from early on, you will remember how placing socialism and fascism on the left is feasible. While many argue against such a claim, allow me to elaborate. Hitler and the communists disagreed on fundamentals, but largely this included the outcomes. Communism is technically more of an international movement, but Hitler's Nazi Party was all about Aryans and Germany. Hitler said, "We are not internationalists. Our socialism is national." Also, I don't believe Hitler ever supported dissolving a government like the communists do in theory. However, it's worth noting that the Nazi Party is the National Socialist Workers' Party. Under Hitler, the government would have great control of the economy. Private ownership was often transferred to someone within the Nazi Party, so take from that what you will. There were high progressive tax rates. There were price fixes and cartels. A 1933 decree removed any guaranteed property rights. Mandatory health insurance was also required eventually. Hitler's tactics were similar to the communists in many ways. Instead of a class war, groups like Jews were bad people. After a government building was burned down in 1933, the party moved towards a removal of communists. The fire was likely a setup of the Nazis from the start. To summarize this section, while aspirations may differ between the fascists and the communists, both are authoritative in nature and are to be avoided.
The Third Reich, the most violently anti-communist regime in existence, had agreed to cooperate with Stalin's dictatorship.
While Germany would break the non-aggression treaty and attack Russia, the opposite may have happened a few months or years later. Stalin's strategy was likely to hold out as long as possible until other European powers were weakened. Following World War II, the US and Soviet Union engaged in the Cold War. Each sought to spread its influence around the world. It was a war of ideas. In hindsight, the Cold War should not have been close. Just a few incompetent decisions swayed the balance of power. It affects the world's political scene today. To introduce what happened, we need to again hear from Bezmenov's expertise on what our enemies have been doing for the past 60 years plus.
What subversion is? Basically, it consists of 4 periods, time-wise. The theory of subversion goes all the way back 2,500 years ago. The first human being who formulated the tactics of subversion was a Chinese philosopher by the name of Sun Tzu. To 2,500 years BC. He was an advisor for several imperial courts in ancient China. And he said, after long meditation, that to implement state policy in a warlike manner, it's the most counterproductive, barbaric, and inefficient to fight on a battlefield. You know that war is continuation of state policy, right? So if you want successfully to implement your state policy and you start fighting, this is the most idiotic way to do it. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy, until such time that the perception of reality of your enemy is screwed up to such an extent that he does not perceive you as an enemy, and that your system, your civilization, and your ambitions look to your enemy as an alternative, if not desirable, then at least feasible. Better red than dead. That's the ultimate purpose, the final stage of subversion, after which you can simply take your enemy without a single shot being fired. Now, subversion is an activity which is a two-way traffic. You cannot subvert an enemy which doesn't want to be subverted. If you know history of Japan, for example, before 20th century, Japan was a closed society. The moment a foreign boat comes to the shores of Japan, the Imperial Japanese Army politely tells them to get lost. And if American salesman comes to the shore of Japan, let's say 60 or 70 years from now back, and says, oh, I have a very beautiful vacuum cleaner for you, with the good financing, he says, please leave us, we don't need your vacuum cleaner. If they don't leave, they shoot them to preserve their culture, ideology, traditions, values intact. You were not able to subvert Japan. The first stage of subversion is the process which is called basically demoralization. It says for itself what it is. What it includes? It includes influencing, or by various methods, infiltration, propaganda methods, direct contacts, doesn't really matter. I will describe them later. Of various areas where public opinion is formulated or shaped. Religion, educational system, social life, administration, law enforcement system, military, of course, and labor and employer relations, economy, okay? Sometimes when I describe all the methods, students ask me a question, are you sure this is the result of the Soviet influence? Not necessarily. You see, the tactic of subversion, about which I'm talking, is similar to the martial art, the Japanese martial art. If some of you are familiar with that tactic, probably you will remember that if an enemy is bigger and heavier than yourself, it would be very painful to resist his direct strike. If a heavier person wants to strike me in the face, it would be very naive and counterproductive to stop his blow. The Chinese and Japanese judo art tells us what to do. First to avoid the strike, then to grab the fist and continue his movement in the direction where it was before, right? Until the enemy crashes in the wall. You see? So, what happens here? The target country obviously does something wrong. If it's a free democratic society, there are many different movements within the society. There are obviously, in every society, there are people who are against this society. They may be simple criminals, ideologically in disagreement with the state policy, conscientious enemies, simply psychotic personalities who are against anything. The moment all these movements will be directed in one direction, right? This is the time to catch that movement and to continue it until the movement forces the whole society into collapse, into crisis, right? So that's exactly the martial art tactic. We don't stop an enemy. We let him go. We help him to go in the direction we want them to go. Okay? One of such group is media. Who elected them? How come they have so much power? Almost monopolistic power on your mind. The next step is destabilization. Again, this word says for itself what it is: to destabilize all the relations, all the accepted institutions and organizations in a country of your enemy. How you do it? You don't have to send a battalion of KGB agents to blow up bridges. No, you let them do it themselves.
At the end of the video, we'll get to some solutions of how to deal with subversion, including some from Bezmenov himself. So, how did this process of subversion lead to a competitive ideological fight in the Cold War? Recall the formation of Communist International at the time of the Russian Revolution. This and other pressures led to several Americans becoming sympathetic to communism. Whittaker Chambers, William Foster, and Elizabeth Bentley are just a few. After eventually finding out the harsh reality of the communist intent, Chambers and Bentley would return to American ideals and seek to correct the wrongs they had committed. Fast forward to World War II now. The internal communist network would lead to the Soviets stealing atomic bomb plans. Just a few years after World War II, they had successfully tested a bomb of their own. The plan sped up the process by years. Next, miscalculations or plain deceit led to communist control of several countries and war in Korea.
Mao Zedong had set out to destroy China's links with the past, to create perpetual revolution. His chosen weapon was the young, his Red Guard.
While China was in revolution, parts of the State Department assumed the best of Mao Zedong and the worst of the current leader Chiang Kai-shek. Even though it was obvious that Zedong had ties with Russia, the department was complacent with the situation. Support eventually came to Chiang Kai-shek, but it was mostly too little and too late. He was forced to Formosa, known also as Taiwan. Now, we obviously are still in a hostile relationship with China, thanks in part to Secretary of State George Marshall's complacency, or maybe honest air. Later, Secretary of State Dean Acheson would communicate U.S. policy in Asia. He shared that the UN would have jurisdiction outside of the U.S. sphere of influence, which left out Korea and Taiwan. This egged on the North Koreans, most likely, to take South Korea. Unfortunately, this communication was a huge mistake. President Truman's policy was not the same, and he got involved in the war. Lastly, negligent foreign policy likely led to Fidel Castro's takeover of Cuba.
Castro's brother Raul is already a self-proclaimed communist. His close associate, Che Guevara, had participated in the unsuccessful revolution in Guatemala. But in the enthusiasm of the revolution, few Cubans, even in the middle class, believe that Fidel Castro will ever turn communist. At first, he promises free elections. He acknowledges many of the traditional rights of citizens and the established institutions of government. But the elections never take place.
While there was more than enough evidence of who Castro was and his intentions, he didn't always make it publicly evident early on that he was communist.
And here's the whole synopsis for me. We have been lulled into carnal security as a nation. Back during World War II and then later in the Cold Wars, communism and fascism were at the forefront of our minds. It was right in our face for quite a few years. And so as an American people, we were very adverse to it. We hated it, didn't like communism, didn't like fascism. Well, then the communists, they didn't stop. It's not like when the Cold War ended, they stopped all of their advancements. They just changed tactics. And especially when you read ancient scripture, and especially when you study the founding of America, and especially when you study the founding of Marxism and the history of Marxism and communism, and with all of those working together in our minds and in our understanding, you start to see what you weren't able to see before.
One person who was really able to discern what was going on and really experienced a lot of what was going on was Secretary of Agriculture Ezra Taft Benson during the Eisenhower years. John F. Kennedy was elected president following President Eisenhower's 2 terms.
But difficult days need not be dark. I think these are proud and memorable days in the cause of peace.
And when President Kennedy was assassinated, there was a very interesting narrative that happened.
Moscow has conducted a 5-year campaign to make American conservatives look like hysterical fanatics. It has called them rightists, extremists, and even fascists. Within an hour after the assassination and before Oswald was captured, Moscow was assuring the world that this crime was the product of the rightist movement in the United States. The second thing which happened was the amazing rapidity with which American liberals took up the Moscow line. And even after Oswald was captured and identified as a Moscow-associated communist, there were those who insisted that any who had opposed the president during his term of high office was guilty of the same spirit of hate as that which led to the president's death. This line of thinking was expressed by a number of prominent persons through the press, radio, and TV. Was it hate when General Albert C. Wedemeyer pleaded with General Marshall and President Truman to reverse their policy before they lost China? Was it hate when Whittaker Chambers tried to warn President Roosevelt in 1939 that Alger Hiss had been giving the Soviet Union more espionage data than any other member of the Washington spy network? Was it hate when J. Edgar Hoover tried to warn President Truman that Harry Dexter White was a member of the Soviet spy apparatus and was doing great danger to the nation as Assistant Secretary of the Treasury? Was it hate when I went to the Secretary of State under President Eisenhower and pleaded with him not to support the communist Fidel Castro? Is it hate when distinguished military leaders advised that an all-out effort could end the Vietnam struggle almost overnight? History will show that many terrible mistakes occurred because the advice of these well-informed and well-meaning citizens was not heeded. Therefore, I repeat, this kind of resistance to a national leader is rooted in love and respect, not hate. Regardless of which political party is in power, you do not want to see your president make a serious blunder. You don't want him to lose China. You don't want him to allow the enemy agents to make fools of us. Therefore, let those who call for unity and the elimination of hate be sure they are not merely trying to silence the friends of freedom.
I know that it's really human nature and they're motivated by the most humanitarian of idealism. It's just natural for them to see the problems and see the immediate problem and to suggest, oh, if we had a little more money, a little more power, what we could do for the people. Now, in an atmosphere of emergency and excessive zeal for our welfare, the federal government proposes to invade an area, the traditional province of the local community and state, the finest public school system in all the world, with no real determination yet that the federal government is the best manager of our educational affairs.
Education is the last major area we will look at.
There is no crime if a professor who recently went to USSR introduces a course of Marxism-Leninism in a Californian college, for example. Nobody is going to come to his doorstep and say, okay, mister, come, you are under arrest. No, it's not a crime.
I invite anyone to look up on the Department of Education. Here's a great website you can go to. It has a spreadsheet, but look up Department of Education foreign donations. And there's a list of entities, organizations, countries, governments that are constantly funding our schools. And it's very disconcerting. And when you put all these things together with the background understanding of the fact that evil doesn't sleep, it's working 24/7 to get rid of your freedom and my freedom, our right to choose. It's working. He is working night and day to make sure that you have less freedom to speak, less freedom to defend yourself, less freedom to worship according to the dictates of your conscience. That's a problem.
For 15 years, No other free nation has demanded so much of itself. If at times our actions seem to make life difficult for others, it is only because history has made life difficult for us all.
Many schools today are teaching that America was and is one of the worst, most racist nations on earth. The reality is that people throughout history have had slavery and racist ideas in one form or another. Slavery never has been only an American problem. It was, unfortunately, a human problem. The self-pity that has been forced on us is unjustifiable.
But if the government is going to build the schools and buy the books, issue scholarships, make judgments, and exert pressure, what if one day that pressure is of a political nature not to our liking? Education is the bulwark of freedom, but you remove it too far from the community and the parents' control, and education becomes the tool of tyranny.
Confucius Institutes were set up first. The first one was set up in 2005, and they've been set up very rapidly since then. And in 2016, there were over 100 Confucius Institutes set up on college campuses. Here's the way it works. They sign a contract. It's basically a one-way contract with a lot of favors. It's favoring China. And the incentive for the universities is it's a way for income to start flowing in. Basically, it's set up as a way to teach Chinese culture and Chinese language. And so the kids can sign up for classes, the students can sign up for classes and pay tuition, but it's being funded by China. And in fact, the faculty members, according to the contracts, must be vetted and chosen by China, by the Hanban, which is the organization that the Chinese Communist Party is using to set these up. So the Chinese Communist Party, which runs the government, is basically has its fingers out in all these Confucius Institutes, and under the guise of just teaching language and culture. But here's the, it's like, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with learning about Chinese culture, right? Or Chinese languages. Of course we want to learn other languages. But here's where it gets a little bit dicey. It's very hush-hush what actually goes on inside these institutes. And it is not just that they're learning about Chinese culture, it's the Chinese Communist Party's version of Chinese history and Chinese culture. But for the universities, it seems like there's no harm in it because there's a lot of money pouring in from the Chinese government. One of the other things that makes it really disconcerting, a little bit, I guess you could call it another red flag, is that the administrators who have signed these contracts are given traveling privileges, so they're able to go to China. They are given events to speak at, and they're given a lot of praise. The underlying purpose seems to be that the Chinese government wants to make a lot of friends. They want to basically bribe people to their way of thinking.
To stop the anti-communist movement in this country, it was an important part of the communist strategy to get their liberal American friends to carry out an attack against patriotic organizations. Of course, the communists have learned not to attack all patriotic groups at once. Their strategy is to focus on just one organization and make it so detestable and ugly in the public mind that they can hold it up as a sort of tar baby and then use it to smear all other individuals or groups in the same category.
Benson gave a warning about a lot of things that are still relevant today, such as pushing narratives to take down organizations and institutions such as the police. I know that things can be improved with the police, but he said we need to support them. We should not completely tear them down.
And among themselves, and all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says the profit motive has become outmoded. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the President as our moral teacher and our leader, and he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. He must be freed so that he can do for us what he knows is best. Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us that the greater risk lies in appeasement. If we continue to accommodate, continue to back and retreat, eventually we have to face the final demand, the ultimatum. And what then? Well, Nikita Khrushchev has told his people he knows what our answer will be. He has told them that we're retreating under the pressure of the Cold War, and someday, when the time comes to deliver the final ultimatum, our surrender will be voluntary, because by that time, we will have been weakened from within spiritually, morally, and economically. He believes this because from our side he's heard voices pleading for peace at any price, or better read than dead, or as one commentator put it, he'd rather live on his knees than die on his feet. And therein lies the road to war, because those voices don't speak for the rest of us. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? Just in the face of this enemy? Or should Moses have told the children of Israel to live in slavery under the Pharaohs? Should Christ have refused the cross? Should the patriots at Concord Bridge have thrown down their guns and refused to fire the shot heard round the world? The martyrs of history were not fools. And our honored dead, who gave their lives to stop the advance of the Nazis, didn't die in vain. Where then is the road to peace? Well, it's a simple answer after all. You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance.
So some solutions are things that we need to take more seriously, such as our family, being good citizens, patriotic, self-restraint as well.
Self-restraint, previously, before this process started, the self-restraint was a business of church, religion. Because our preachers, the fathers of church, would tell us, material values are good, but it's not the prime function of human being. Because you have to live with something. Obviously, the design for our life is not to consume more deodorants. There must be something greater.
We have to understand that the government is not going to be the solution to all our problems. In the Declaration of Independence, it explains how there's only one way for us to be able to fully trust in government.
And the grievances, it shows us how the separation of powers was lacking in their former systems of government under the King of Great Britain. And so sheds light on why they thought it was so important. So the Declaration of Independence is very instructive, and it's a really powerful point to understand how the Founding Fathers believed that only God could rightfully hold all three branches of power, and that because of our human frailties, because of our human nature, no single person or no single group of people could be trusted with all three branches of power.
And what's really interesting, and this is the way that the adversary or the devil, Satan, whatever you want to call him, the way that he works and the way that his minions work is they take a little bit of truth and then they twist it. They twist it around. And so a lot of this constricting of freedom is happening in the name of freedom and in the name of tolerance. Think about that for a minute. And over the last year, I have finally woken up to this. And I'm kind of ashamed to not have seen it before. I used to be one of those that thought, oh, those are just, that can't happen in America. Not here, not now. We've moved on from that. We've progressed. That's a big word that we use nowadays, right? We're progressive. We've moved beyond, those wars and the lying and deceiving between nations. But it's all been happening under our noses. If someone tries to take your home, take your liberty and take over your life, you will resist it outright. But what if it's done in little baby steps? What if your thinking is poisoned by degrees over time? The devil's very patient. And China and the communist movement is a criminal movement. It's not political. It's not a political movement. It's not legitimate. It is a criminal movement. They act, think, and speak like criminals. Take some time to start studying. Study the scriptures. Study the Bible. Study the Constitution and the Founding Fathers. Study the Federalist Papers. And on the flip side of that coin, study communism. Study Marxism. Study how they work. And you'll start to see how black and white current events really are.
If you're unwilling to meet this challenge, then you'd better start preparing, deciding what you'll tell your children it was that you found more important than freedom. They'll want to know.
Sterling Sills said in 1971, "It will be our soul power that will make us live on as the world's all-time greatest nation."